A married woman in England has no legal existence. That is not a metaphor. That is not poetic license. In 1836, that was the law. The moment a woman spoke her wedding vows, she ceased to be a person in the eyes of English law. Her property became her husband's property. Her income became his income. Her children belonged to him, completely, irrevocably, without exception. She could not sign a contract. She could not appear in court. She could not leave his house without his permission. And if he chose to beat her, to humiliate her, to take her children and lock the door behind him, the full weight of English law stood behind him like a wall of stone. This is the true story of a woman who was destroyed by that wall, and then tore it down, brick by brick, with nothing but a pen and a fury that would outlast every man who tried to silence her. Welcome to aristocratic hearts. In 1836 England, a woman's worth was measured in dowries, bloodlines, and the willingness to disappear into her husband's shadow. But tonight's story is about a woman who refused to disappear, and what it cost her. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you are right now. Whether it is morning, where you are, or the dead of night. Whether you are driving, or resting, or somewhere in between. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read everyone. Now, this story does not have a duke who rides in to save the day. There is no possessive hero. There is no romantic rescue. What there is, instead, is something far more extraordinary, a woman who saved herself, who saved her children, and who, in doing so, changed the law for every woman in England who came after her. Her name was Caroline Norton, and this is what they did to her. She was born Caroline Elizabeth Sarah Sheridan on the 22nd of March, 1808, in a house that smelled of old paper and faded grandeur. Her grandfather was Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the most celebrated playwright in England, the man who had written The School for Scandal and The Rivals, who had sat in Parliament for over 30 years, who had been the intimate friend of the Prince of Wales, and had once delivered a speech in the House of Commons so brilliant that the members voted to adjourn simply because no one wished to speak after him. The Sheridan name opened every door in London. The Sheridan fortune, however, was dust. Richard Sheridan had died in 1816, 2 years before Caroline could form any memory of him. The wealth that should have accompanied such a name had been squandered decades before his coffin was lowered into Poets' Corner at Westminster Abbey. Spent on the Drury Lane Theatre, on elections, on a lifestyle that required constant borrowing from friends who were too dazzled by his wit to refuse. What he left behind was a family of extraordinary beauty, extraordinary talent, and almost no money at all. Caroline's father, Thomas Sheridan, served as colonial secretary at the Cape of Good Hope. A capable, honest man with a modest salary and 7 children to raise on it. Her mother, Caroline Henrietta Callender, was a Scottish woman of spirit and intelligence who would later turn to writing novels to supplement the family's strained finances. The children grew up in that peculiar English condition of being well-born and poor. Invited to dinners they could not afford to host in return, wearing gowns that had been turned and retrimmed more times than was decent, navigating a social world that respected their bloodline while whispering about their empty purses. Of the 3 Sheridan sisters, all were beautiful. This was not idle compliment. It was documented, painted, celebrated, and remarked upon by virtually everyone who encountered them. The 3 granddaughters of Sheridan were treated almost as public property, their faces sketched in newspapers, their appearances at events noted in the society columns. Helen, the eldest, was classically lovely, fair and composed. Georgiana, the youngest, was soft, gentle, golden-haired. But Caroline, the middle sister, The difficult one, the one who could not hold her tongue, was something else entirely. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed, with a face that painters fought to capture and a wit that could silence a room. Lord Melbourne, who would one day stand at the very centre of her ruin, once said she was the most beautiful woman in London. Byron's friend Samuel Rogers called her a perfect Titian beauty. The painter George Hayter depicted her with eyes so alive they seemed to challenge the viewer directly, as if daring anyone to underestimate her. She had the kind of presence that commanded attention, not through meekness or modesty, but through a crackling intelligence that lit her features like a flame behind glass. She could write brilliantly, fluently, in verse and prose with a facility that reminded people constantly of her grandfather. She could argue with any man in any drawing room in England, and she frequently did. She had opinions, and she stated them, about politics, about literature, about the way the world treated women who dared to have a thought that had not been placed there by a man. She was funny, acid, perceptive, and utterly unafraid of the consequences of being all three at once. The Sheridan children had grown up steeped in language. Their mother read to them, wrote with them, encouraged them to argue their positions at the dinner table. In a household that could not afford governesses of the quality that wealthier families employed, books were the education. Shakespeare and Pope and Swift, and of course their grandfathers' plays, read aloud by candlelight in a drawing-room that was elegant in proportion and shabby in furnishing. Caroline absorbed it all with the voracious appetite of a mind that could not bear to be idle. By the time she was 16, she had already begun to write poetry, not the pale, decorative verse that young ladies were expected to produce as an accomplishment, like needlework or watercolor, but work of genuine ambition and surprising emotional power. She wrote about love and loss and longing with the authority of someone who had already, at 16, experienced enough of the world's cruelty to know what those words meant. The death of her father, the slow erosion of the family's position, the constant pressure to be beautiful and charming and marriageable while possessing nothing of material value. All of it fed her pen. In an era that prized female silence above almost all other feminine virtues, Caroline Sheridan was constitutionally incapable of being quiet. This would save her, and it would very nearly destroy her first. Her father died in 1817, when Caroline was 9 years old. He had been posted to the Cape Colony in South Africa, where the warm climate was supposed to improve his failing health. It did not. He died far from home, far from his children, leaving his wife with 7 young mouths to feed, a celebrated name, and an income that would not stretch to cover the life that name demanded. The Sheridan women were now, in the language of the era, genteel poor, and there was no more precarious position a woman could occupy in Regency England. Too well-born to seek employment, too poor to live as their rank required, and entirely dependent upon the marriages their beauty might secure. Their mother understood this arithmetic with the cold clarity of a woman who had watched poverty close in around her like fog. Her daughters must marry. They must marry well. And they must marry before the bloom of youth faded, and they found themselves on the shelf. That dreaded phrase that haunted every unmarried woman past the age of 25. Helen married first. She married Captain Price Blackwood, who would later inherit the title of Lord Dufferin. It was a good match. Respectable, affectionate, financially stable. Georgiana married the Duke of Somerset. It was an excellent match, one of the great titles in England. A fortune, a position in society that most women could only dream of. And Caroline, the most beautiful of the three, the sharpest, the most difficult, the one whose intelligence burned so brightly that it made certain men uncomfortable. Caroline was introduced to George Chapel Norton. He was the younger brother of Lord Grantley, a baron. He was a barrister, though his practice was unremarkable. He had a seat in Parliament, representing Guildford, though his political career showed little promise of distinction. He was handsome enough, dark-haired, with a heavy jaw, and the kind of physical solidity that could be mistaken for strength of character. And he was charming. That is the detail that matters most, and the detail most easily forgotten, because history tends to flatten its villains into monsters from the beginning. And George Norton was not a monster at the beginning. He was a man who wanted something and who understood that the fastest route to obtaining it was to make himself agreeable. He called on her. He brought flowers, hothouse roses that must have cost him more than he could comfortably afford, though Caroline did not know that then. He listened when she spoke, which was unusual enough in a man of his class and generation to feel remarkable. He laughed at her jokes, not with the strained tolerance of men who found clever women unsettling, but with what appeared to be genuine delight. He complimented her not only on her beauty, which every man did, but on her mind, which almost none of them bothered to acknowledge. He told her she was extraordinary. He told her that other women bored him, that their conversation was empty, their interests shallow, their company tedious. He told her that she was different, that she was the only woman in London who could hold his attention for an entire evening without making him wish he were somewhere else. Caroline was 19. She had grown up watching her mother count pennies and mend gowns and navigate the humiliating arithmetic of genteel poverty. She had watched her sisters secure good marriages and felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her own shoulders. The unspoken understanding that her beauty was the family's last remaining asset, and that it must be deployed before time diminished its value. She was brilliant, yes. She was witty and well-read and capable of holding her own with anyone. But she was also 19 years old and poor and lonely in the particular way that young women are lonely when the world values them for everything, except the thing they most want to be valued for, which is themselves. George Norton looked at her as though he saw herself. That was his gift, the ability to reflect back to a woman exactly the image she most longed to see. And Caroline, who had spent her entire young life being admired for her face while her mind went hungry, believed him. She believed that this solid, attentive, seemingly kind man truly saw her. She was wrong. But she could not have known that. No one warned her. No one could have warned her because the man George Norton presented during courtship bore almost no resemblance to the man he became the moment the wedding ring was on her finger and the law declared her his property. And when the match was proposed to Caroline's mother, the Norton family gave assurances that George possessed a sufficient income to support a wife in the manner their daughter deserved. It was a lie. Or perhaps not a lie exactly. Perhaps merely an exaggeration so extravagant that it amounted to the same thing. George Norton had expectations, certainly. He expected to inherit from his elder brother, Lord Grantley. But Lord Grantley was alive, healthy, and showed no inclination to share his income in the meantime. George's legal practice generated very little because he was, by virtually all accounts, indolent, a man who believed his birth entitled him to comfort and who resented the suggestion that he should have to work for it. He needed a wife with connections, a wife with beauty, a wife whose social brilliance could unlock the doors that his own pedestrian talents could not. Caroline's mother, desperate to see her middle daughter settled, encouraged the match. Caroline herself had reservations, small ones, the kind that could be dismissed as nerves, the kind that every bride was supposed to feel. She would, later, write that she had wept on her wedding day and could not explain why. Something in her, Some instinct buried beneath the flowers and the congratulations and the pressure to be grateful sensed what was coming. But she was 19 and poor, and a woman in Regency England did not refuse a respectable offer of marriage because of a feeling she could not name. The machinery of expectation was already in motion, and she had no weapons with which to stop it. They married on the 30th of July, 1827. She wore white silk. He smiled for the guests. The church was filled with Sheridans and Nortons and all the appropriate connections of both families. Her mother wept with relief. Her sisters wished her well. And when the last toast was drunk and the last well-wisher departed, the door closed behind Caroline Sheridan Norton. And she discovered exactly what kind of man she had married. The violence began almost immediately. Their first home was not the comfortable London townhouse Caroline had been led to expect, but a set of cramped barristers' chambers with a single elderly servant to attend them. The gap between what had been promised and what had been delivered was the first wound, and it opened before the honeymoon was over. George saw the disappointment on her face, the quick flash of dismay when she first surveyed the rooms where she was expected to begin her married life, and he responded not with apology, but with rage. How dare she be disappointed? How dare she expect more than he could provide? How dare she, by the simple act of looking at a room, remind him that he was not the man his brother was, not the man her sisters' husbands were, not the man that her beauty and her name deserved? George Norton was a jealous man, not with the jealousy of a man who loves too fiercely, but with the jealousy of ownership. He regarded Caroline the way he might regard a horse or a house, as property whose value reflected upon him and whose admiration by others constituted a kind of theft. Her beauty, the very quality that had attracted him, became the thing that most enraged him. When men admired her, and they always did, because she was impossible not to admire, George did not swell with pride. He seethed, and the seething had a physical expression that Caroline learned to recognize and to dread. The tightening of his jaw, the way his hand would close into a fist at his side, the particular quality of silence that descended over him just before the storm broke. He hit her. He kicked her. During one quarrel, he flung a heavy inkstand at her face. During another, he seized her by the arm and threw her to the floor. He grabbed her by the wrists and dragged her across the carpet while she screamed. On one occasion, and she documented this with the same unflinching clarity she brought to everything, he took hold of her by the nape of her neck and slammed her against a door. He beat her with whatever was nearest to hand. He beat her with his fists when nothing else was available. During another confrontation, he kicked her so violently in her side that she could not stand upright for days afterward. The bruises were hidden beneath layers of petticoats and the high-necked gowns of the era. The architecture of women's clothing in the 1830s was, whether by design or by coincidence, perfectly suited to concealing the evidence of a husband's violence. When she was 7 months pregnant with their first child, he beat her so severely that she fell against a piece of furniture and feared for the life of the baby within her. She would later describe this assault in her published writings, because the written record was the only weapon the law permitted her. A wife could not bring charges of assault against her husband. The law did not recognize domestic violence as a crime, for the simple reason that the law regarded a wife and husband as a single legal entity, and a man could not, by definition, commit an offence against himself. Their first son, Fletcher, was born in 1829. Brinsley Thomas followed in 1831. William Charles, the youngest, arrived in 1833. 3 boys in 4 years, born into a household where the sound of their mother's distress was as ordinary as the settling of the coal fire in the grate. Whether the children witnessed the violence directly, Caroline never said. But children hear what happens in the rooms around them, and the walls of London houses in the 1830s were not thick enough to contain the sounds of a man in a fury. Caroline did what generations of women before her had done. She endured. She made excuses to her family, to her friends, to herself. She left briefly and returned. She left again and returned again. She negotiated fragile truces that lasted weeks or months before shattering with the inevitable next provocation. A man who had smiled at her too warmly at dinner, a letter from a friend that George had opened and read. An imagined slight that existed only in the fever of his possessiveness. Each time the cycle repeated, the blow, the remorse, the tearful apologies, the tenderness that felt almost like love, the slow rebuilding of a hope so fragile that the slightest breath could shatter it, and then the blow again. Always the blow again. But Caroline Sheridan Norton was not a woman built solely for endurance. She was built for expression, for argument, for the transformative alchemy of turning experience into language. And so, even as her marriage darkened around her like a room losing its last candle, she began to write. Her first volume of poetry, The Sorrows of Rosalie, was published. In 1829, the same year her firstborn arrived. It was well received. More work followed with striking rapidity. The Undying One. In 1830, a narrative poem that drew comparisons to Byron. Not because her style was Byronic, but because the emotional intensity, the willingness to confront darkness, reminded critics of a talent they had thought was gone from English poetry. She was 22 years old. She was married to a man who despised her, and she was writing verse that made reviewers invoke the name of the most celebrated poet of the age. She wrote not merely to express herself, though expression was as necessary to her as breathing. She wrote to earn. Because George Norton's income was, as she had now discovered, almost entirely insufficient to maintain a household, and someone had to pay the bills. The landlord required payment. The servants required wages. The boys required clothing, food, the countless small expenses of raising children in a household that pretended to a respectability it could not afford. And so Caroline sat at her writing desk in the early morning hours while the house was still quiet, composing verse until the candle burned down to a stub and the first grey light of dawn crept through the curtains. And she earned the money that kept the household running. Money that, by law, was not hers. The irony was exquisite and vicious. She was supporting the man who beat her. She was earning money with her own mind and her own talent, and every single penny belonged to him by law. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman could not own property, could not retain earnings, could not enter contracts in her own name. If a publisher wished to pay Caroline Norton for her work, the payment went to George Norton's account. If she wished to sign a contract for a new book, George's signature was required. The woman who was doing the writing had no legal claim upon the rewards of her own labour. Caroline Norton's literary income went directly into George Norton's pocket, and there was not a court in England that would have said otherwise. More works followed through the early 1830s. She wrote novels, short fiction, essays for the leading periodicals of the day. She was prolific because she could not afford to be otherwise, and because writing was the only space in which she exercised any control over her own existence. At her desk, with a sheet of paper before her and a pen in her hand, she was not George Norton's bruised and frightened wife. She was Caroline Sheridan's granddaughter, heir to a dynasty of words, and the sentences that flowed from her pen were the one thing her husband could not take from her, though he would in time claim every penny they earned. But her pen was not her only weapon. She had inherited her grandfather's genius for social performance, and she deployed it with devastating effect. Her drawing room became one of the most sought-after salons in London, a place where politicians, poets, artists, and aristocrats gathered beneath crystal chandeliers in an atmosphere of candlelight, brilliant conversation, and the magnetic presence of the most celebrated woman in the room. And she was funny. Not in the gentle, self-deprecating way that society permitted women to be amusing. The careful, unthreatening wit of a woman who knows her place. Caroline's humour had teeth. She once sat at a dinner party beside a lord who spent the first 3 courses explaining to her, in the slow, patient tones that men reserved for women and spaniels, that female education was a waste of resources because women's brains were not designed for sustained intellectual effort. Caroline listened without interruption. She smiled at the appropriate moments. She allowed him to finish his port. And then she said, with perfect composure, "My lord, I believe you have just proved, over the course of an entire meal, that sustained intellectual effort is not strictly a matter of the brain's design, for yours has managed to avoid it entirely, and you seem none the worse for the experience." The table went silent. Then it erupted. The story was repeated in 3 clubs before midnight, and had reached the coffee houses by morning. This was what Caroline Norton did. She made people want to be in the room when she spoke because you never knew when the next line would land, and you did not want to hear about it second-hand. She was sharp, she was acid, and she was fearless in a way that delighted some men and terrified others. She could reduce a pompous politician to stammering with a single observation. She could turn a dry parliamentary debate into a story so vivid that her listeners forgot they had not been there. She had the Sheridan gift, the ability to make language perform, to make words land with the precision of thrown knives, and to do it all with a smile so charming that her targets were not always certain until hours later that they had been hit. She understood something that most women of her era did not. That conversation was a form of power, and that a woman who could hold the attention of powerful men could shape events far beyond the walls of her drawing room. She was not merely decorative, though she was certainly beautiful. She was strategic. She cultivated friendships with cabinet ministers, with editors of influential journals, with members of parliament, with the men who controlled opinion and policy. She made herself indispensable to the social machinery of political London. The hostess whose gatherings could not be missed, the wit whose observations were repeated in clubs and coffee houses the following morning, the woman who could make an introduction that altered the course of a career. She made herself visible in a world that wanted women to be invisible. And in doing so, she caught the eye of the most powerful man in England. William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, was the Home Secretary when he first became a regular visitor to Caroline Norton's drawing room. He was in his early 50s. She was in her early 20s. He was recently widowed. His wife, the famously volatile Lady Caroline Lamb, had died in 1828 after years of public scandal and private anguish, leaving Melbourne with a melancholy that settled over him like dust on an unused room. He was drawn to clever women. He was drawn to beauty. And in Caroline Norton's drawing room, he found both in quantities that the rest of London could not match. Their friendship deepened rapidly. Melbourne visited frequently, sometimes daily. He arrived in the late afternoon, when George was at his magistrate's court or at his club, and stayed for hours. They sat together in Caroline's drawing room, talking about everything. Politics, literature, philosophy, the latest parliamentary debates, the latest society scandal. Melbourne was a brilliant conversationalist when he chose to be. Dryly witty, deeply read, with a mind that ranged across subjects with the ease of a man who had been educated at Eton and Cambridge and had spent 30 years in public life. Caroline matched him, thought for thought. She challenged his opinions. She made him laugh. She was not afraid to tell the Prime Minister of England that he was wrong, and Melbourne, who was surrounded by men who told him only what he wished to hear, found this intoxicating. For Caroline, the friendship was a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. At home, she lived with a man who resented her intelligence and punished her for it. In Melbourne's company, she was not merely tolerated, she was valued. Her opinions mattered. Her wit was appreciated rather than punished. For a few hours each afternoon, she was treated as a mind, as a person, as an equal. Everything that her marriage denied her. Whether the relationship was physically intimate is a question that has occupied historians for nearly 200 years, and the answer remains genuinely uncertain. Caroline denied it emphatically until her dying day. Melbourne never addressed it directly. The evidence is ambiguous. They spent a great deal of time alone together, which was unusual for a married woman and a single man in this era. But the servant's testimony at the trial was so thoroughly discredited that it cannot be relied upon. What is clear is that the bond between them was deep, genuine, and immensely important to both of them, particularly to Caroline, who had so little else. What is beyond dispute is this: George Norton knew about the friendship, tolerated it, encouraged it, and profited from it enormously. He was not a subtle man, but he was not stupid either. He understood that his wife's intimate friendship with one of the most powerful politicians in England was a resource, and he exploited it with the same cold practicality he brought to everything. When Melbourne became Prime Minister in July 1834, George Norton's fortunes improved accordingly. It was through Caroline's influence, through the doors her charm and her intelligence had opened, that George was appointed a Metropolitan Police Magistrate at Lambeth, a position carrying a salary of £1,000 per year. £1,000 a year. For a man who had done nothing to earn it, who had contributed nothing to the connections that had secured it, who had spent the years of his wife's social triumph hitting her behind closed doors. George Norton accepted the appointment, pocketed the income, and somehow found a way to resent his wife more than ever. The resentment was the strangest aspect of the entire arrangement. He accepted every advantage Caroline brought him and despised her for it. He despised that men of rank sought her company while his own career stagnated in mediocrity. He despised that she was admired, quoted, painted, celebrated. He despised that she was brilliant and that he was not. And when his own ambitions failed completely, he lost his parliamentary seat in 1830 and no political career of any significance followed. He turned the full force of his bitter, thwarted ego upon the woman who had done everything in her power to prop him up. The marriage ground onward through the early 1830s, lurching between cruelty and fragile peace. Caroline left briefly in 1833 and went to her sister's house. George sent word that she must return. Under the law, a husband could pursue his wife into any dwelling and demand her return, and a wife who refused could be compelled by force. Caroline returned. She always returned, because the law ensured that she had nowhere else to go. Then, in the spring of 1836, everything shattered at once. On a morning in late March 1836, Caroline left home to visit her sister. It was an ordinary departure, a carriage ride across London, the kind of errand she had performed 100 times. She expected to return by evening. She did not say goodbye to the boys in any special way. She did not hold them longer than usual, did not press her lips to their foreheads with the desperate tenderness of a woman who knows she is seeing her children for the last time. Because she did not know. She had no warning. No one told her. When she came back, the house was silent in a way that no house containing 3 young boys should ever be silent. She called their names. No one answered. She went to the nursery and found it empty. The beds made, the toys untouched, the small coats missing from their hooks. She searched the house. She called for the servants, and one of them with the terrified eyes of a person who has been instructed to say nothing and cannot bear to say nothing, told her what had happened. Fletcher was gone. He was 7. Brinsley was gone. He was 5. William was gone. He was 3. He had been crying when they took him. George had removed all 3 children while Caroline was away. He had arranged it with military precision. A carriage, a chaperone, a destination. He had placed them with a female cousin, a Miss Vaughan, at an undisclosed address and sent word through his solicitor that Caroline would not be permitted to see them. The solicitor's letter was formal, brief, and delivered without comment. It did not explain George's reasons. It did not need to. The law required no reasons. A father's right to his children was absolute, and the exercise of that right required no justification, no hearing, no notice, and no appeal. Caroline went to every authority she could find. She went to magistrates and was told the law was clear. She went to solicitors and was told nothing could be done. She went to her own family and was met with sympathy but helplessness. What could they do? What could anyone do? The law was the law. She went to the homes of the powerful men she had hosted and charmed and entertained, men who had sat in her drawing room drinking her wine and laughing at her wit, and they shook their heads with genuine sadness and told her that her husband was within his rights. Within his rights. The phrase must have landed like a blow to the chest. Every time she heard it, it must have felt like being struck all over again. Not by George's fists this time, but by the immovable, impersonal, utterly indifferent weight of a legal system that had decided, centuries before she was born, that she did not matter. But George Norton was not finished, because the removal of the children was not, it turned out, merely an act of domestic spite. It was the opening move in a calculated campaign of destruction, a campaign that had political as well as personal dimensions, and that would, before it was finished, drag the Prime Minister of Great Britain into a courtroom and set the entire government trembling. George Norton, or perhaps the political allies who whispered strategy into his willing ear, had conceived a plan of breathtaking cynicism. If he could prove that Caroline had committed adultery with Lord Melbourne, he could accomplish 2 things simultaneously. He could ruin his wife's reputation so thoroughly that no one would listen to her complaints about his violence, and he could embarrass Melbourne, a Whig Prime Minister loathed by the Tory opposition, so badly that it might destabilise the government itself. Politics and personal cruelty fused into a single weapon. It was, in its way, almost elegant. In June 1836, George Norton filed a suit for criminal conversation against Lord Melbourne. Criminal conversation was the legal term for adultery, a civil action brought by a husband against the man who had supposedly seduced his wife. It was not a criminal proceeding in the modern sense, but it carried consequences that were devastating. George demanded £10,000 in damages, roughly £1 million in today's currency. The case was heard before a jury at the Court of Common Pleas on the 22nd of June, 1836. All of London stopped to watch. The courtroom was packed to the walls, spectators crushed into every available space, craning their necks for a glimpse of the participants, the air thick with the heat of too many bodies and the electric charge of scandal. The newspapers had been stoking anticipation for weeks, printing every rumour, every speculation, every morsel of gossip that could be gleaned from servants and solicitors and anyone else willing to talk. This was not merely a marital dispute. It was a political event of the first magnitude. The Prime Minister of Great Britain was being accused of sleeping with another man's wife. The implications for the government, for the Crown, for the stability of the entire political order were enormous. Caroline herself was not present. She could not be. Under the law, a wife was not a party to a criminal conversation suit. She was the property over which two men were fighting, like a disputed field or a stolen horse. She had no right to appear, no right to testify, no right to defend her own reputation. She could not tell the jury that her husband had beaten her. She could not describe the ink bottle flung at her head, the kicks that left bruises hidden beneath her petticoats, the night he struck her when she was 7 months gone with child. She could not explain that George had encouraged Melbourne's visits, profited from them, used them to advance his own career. She could not say any of this because the law did not permit her to speak. Instead, she sat at home. She sat in a room with the curtains drawn while, half a mile away, a jury of 12 men she would never face decided whether she was a whore. She had no advocate in that courtroom. No voice, no presence. She was discussed, examined, dissected, and judged entirely in absentia. A woman rendered invisible by the very legal system that was, at that moment, deciding the course of her life. She would later describe the experience of that day as the most desolating of her life, worse than the beatings, worse even than the loss of the children, because those had been private agonies. This was public. This was the whole of London watching. This was her name being spoken alongside words like criminal, conversation, and adultery in a room full of strangers, and she could not so much as stand up and say, "He is lying." And what the jury heard was one of the most transparently fabricated cases in English legal history. George Norton's evidence rested primarily upon the testimony of former servants, employees who had been dismissed from the Norton household and who, it emerged under cross-examination, had been offered inducements to testify. The star witness was a woman named Fluke, a former servant who claimed to have seen Melbourne visiting Caroline in the afternoons when George was away. She described entering rooms and finding them together on sofas in positions she considered compromising. Under questioning, her account became confused and contradictory. She could not recall dates, could not describe the layout of the rooms consistently, and appeared to have been coached on the details she did remember. A second servant offered testimony that was even more damaging to the prosecution's case. She described an incident that, when examined closely, was physically impossible, given the arrangement of the furniture in the room she described. A third witness, a former coachman, gave evidence so vague and inconsistent that even the prosecution seemed to wince. Melbourne's counsel, Sir John Campbell, the Attorney General of England no less, who had volunteered to defend the Prime Minister personally, took each witness apart with devastating precision. He exposed the contradictions. He demonstrated the impossibilities. He produced evidence that several of the witnesses had been dismissed for misconduct and bore grudges against Caroline. He showed that George Norton had not only known about Melbourne's visits, but had actively encouraged them, had dined with Melbourne in his own home, had written friendly letters to the man he was now accusing of destroying his marriage. The most damning evidence against George's case came from George himself. Letters were produced showing that he had been perfectly content with Melbourne's friendship, had in fact profited from it enormously, right up until the moment when Melbourne's patronage ceased to be useful. The timeline was clear. George had tolerated the friendship when it advanced his career and cried adultery only when it stopped serving his interests. The jury did not even leave the box. They returned a verdict of not guilty without retiring to deliberate. One of the most emphatic acquittals the court had ever seen. The foreman pronounced the words, and a murmur swept through the courtroom that was part relief and part contempt. Melbourne was cleared. Caroline's virtue was officially, legally intact. And here was the trap, because the verdict that cleared her name was the same verdict that sealed her prison. Under the law of 1836, divorce required an Act of Parliament, and one of the essential preconditions was proof of the wife's adultery. The jury had found no such proof, which meant that the Nortons could not divorce. Caroline was still legally married to George, still his property, still subject to his authority in every aspect of her existence. Her earnings still belonged to him, her movements could still be controlled by him, and her children, her 3 sons, whom she had not been permitted to touch since March, still belonged to him completely. She had been publicly vindicated and privately condemned. The law that had cleared her name was the same law that kept her in chains. What followed was a refinement of cruelty that even George Norton's most ardent defenders, and he had few, struggled to justify. He denied Caroline access to the boys. Not reluctantly, not as a temporary measure during the upheaval of the trial, but deliberately, systematically, and with what can only be described as relish. He permitted her on rare occasions to see the children under rigid supervision, visits conducted in the presence of his solicitor, limited in duration, designed not to comfort her, but to remind her of what she had lost. Then he withdrew even that. He moved the boys out of London entirely. He placed them in the care of relatives. He ensured that Caroline did not know precisely where they were. Meanwhile, Lord Melbourne, cleared by the jury but chastened by the scandal, pulled away from Caroline's life with the pragmatic swiftness of a politician who understood that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. He remained Prime Minister. He had a government to run. And the friendship that had been Caroline's intellectual lifeline became a liability he could no longer sustain. She wrote to him. In the weeks after the trial, when the silence of her empty house was becoming unbearable, when the absence of her children was a wound that would not close, she wrote to the one man in England who had the power to help her and who she believed, because he had given her every reason to believe, cared for her enough to do so. She wrote carefully because she understood politics. She did not beg. She did not make demands. She asked for his counsel. She asked in the measured language of a woman who knew how to read a room, even when the room was a sheet of paper, whether he might use his influence to help her see her sons. He did not reply. She wrote again, this time less carefully. The composure was beginning to crack, not in the words themselves, which remained controlled, but in the frequency. A second letter, then a third, then a fourth, arriving at Downing Street with the regularity of a heartbeat. She was not writing to the Prime Minister now. She was writing to the man who had sat in her drawing room every afternoon for years, who had laughed at her jokes, who had held her hand when George's violence became too much to bear alone, who had told her that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever known. That man did not answer. Melbourne was not deliberately cruel about it. Melbourne rarely was. That was the particular refinement of this abandonment. He did not write back to say he could not help. He did not send word through an intermediary that the friendship must end. He did not give her the dignity of a rejection she could rage against. He simply stopped. He stopped calling. He stopped writing. He made himself unavailable in the way that powerful men have always made themselves unavailable when association with a particular woman threatens to become inconvenient. Not with a door slammed shut, but with a door that is simply never answered, so that the woman on the other side is left standing in the hallway, knocking, long after everyone inside has moved to another room. Caroline understood. She was too. She, intelligent not to understand. The man who had been her intellectual equal, her refuge, her proof that she was more than George Norton's bruised possession, that man had weighed the cost of standing beside her and found it too high. He had not been forced to abandon her. He had chosen to. And the choice had been easy enough that he had not even bothered to explain it. Years later, when she was asked about Melbourne, Caroline's public responses were measured and gracious. She never denounced him, never attacked him in print, never used her pen against the man who had left her stranded in the wreckage of a scandal that bore his name as much as hers. But there is a silence in that restraint that says more than any accusation could. She forgave George nothing and said everything. She forgave Melbourne nothing and said nothing at all. Draw your own conclusions about which betrayal cut deeper. Caroline was alone in a way that defies casual description. She could not see her children. She could not divorce her husband. She could not earn money that the law would allow her to keep. The friend who had been her connection to power and influence had retreated behind the walls of Downing Street without so much as a farewell. And society, which had followed the trial with the breathless, voyeuristic appetite that scandal always provokes, had moved on to the next sensation, leaving her stranded in the aftermath like wreckage after a storm. There is a particular cruelty in the way society treated women in Caroline's position. A cruelty that went beyond the law, beyond the courts, beyond anything that could be written in a statute book. Even though the jury had acquitted her, even though Melbourne had been cleared, the taint of the accusation clung to her like smoke. There were drawing rooms that no longer welcomed her. There were women, wives of men who had once sought her company eagerly, who crossed the street to avoid her. The whispers did not stop because the verdict was in. They simply changed in character. From breathless speculation to knowing smirks, from scandalized gossip to the particular poisonous sympathy that society reserved for women who had been publicly associated with dishonor, whether or not the dishonor was real. She had been tried and acquitted, and it did not matter. In the court of public opinion, the accusation was the conviction. The fact that her husband had been proven a liar and a schemer in open court, that his witnesses had been exposed as fabricators and his motives revealed as mercenary, did nothing to repair her reputation. It was her name that had been spoken alongside the word adultery, and in the mathematics of scandal, that was enough. George, meanwhile, continued to claim her literary income. When she published poetry, the royalties went to his account. When she accepted payment for prose, he demanded it. The law was explicit and merciless. A married woman's earnings were her husband's property, and no amount of separation, no history of violence, no verdict of any court could change that fact. Caroline Norton was funding the life of the man who had stolen her children, and she was powerless to stop it. She lived in rented rooms. She counted every shilling. She accepted help from her sisters when pride would allow it, and sometimes when it would not. The woman who had once presided over one of the most glittering salons in London was now calculating whether she could afford a fire in both rooms, or must choose one and shiver in the other. It was at this point, stripped of her children, abandoned by her allies, publicly humiliated, financially drained, socially diminished, that a lesser woman might have done what the world expected and retreated into silence. George expected it. Society expected it. The defeated wife was supposed to fade quietly into the margins and trouble no one with her suffering. She was supposed to accept her lot with the graceful resignation and that well-bred English women had been practicing for centuries. To smile, to endure, to die a little every day without making a fuss about it. Caroline Norton picked up her pen instead. In 1837, Caroline published a pamphlet with a title that was itself an act of defiance. Observations on the natural claim of a mother to the custody of her children as affected by the common law right of the father. It was not poetry. It was not fiction. It was not the kind of elegant literary production that society expected from a beautiful woman with a famous name. It was a legal argument, rigorous, detailed, devastating in its clarity. Written by a woman who could not set foot in any court in England, but who understood the law more thoroughly than most of the men who practiced it. She laid out the facts with surgical precision. Under English common law, a father's right to his children was absolute. It did not matter if the father was cruel, negligent, drunken, violent, or deranged. It did not matter if he had beaten their mother in their presence, if he had abandoned them to the indifferent care of servants, if he had demonstrated by every measure available that he was unfit to raise a dog, let alone a child. The law granted him total custody, and the law asked no questions. A mother, meanwhile, had no legal standing whatsoever. She could be the most devoted, capable, loving parent in England, and the law would not grant her so much as the right to know where her children slept. Her bond with them, the bond of pregnancy, of birth, of nursing, of years of daily care, was legally invisible. The law did not see it, because the law did not see her. Caroline wrote with a fury that burned beneath every carefully constructed sentence. She was not ranting. She was building a case. She documented her own situation, and then, with the instinct of someone who understood that one woman's suffering could be dismissed as an exception, she documented dozens of others. She gathered stories from across England. Women separated from their children by husbands who wielded the law like a weapon. Women who had no recourse, no appeal, no voice. She sent copies to every member of Parliament she could reach. She enlisted Thomas Talfourd, a barrister, poet, and member of Parliament who had been moved by her case, to introduce a bill in the House of Commons. The custody of infants. Bill proposed something that had never before been proposed in the history of English law, that a mother of good character, not convicted of adultery, should have the right to petition the Court of Chancery for custody of her children under the age of 7, and for access to her older children at defined intervals. It was a modest proposal. It did not suggest equality. It did not challenge the fundamental structure of paternal authority. It merely suggested that a mother was not nothing, that her bond with her young children had some value, some legal weight, some claim upon the conscience of a civilized nation. The bill was introduced in 1838. It was debated, and it was defeated. George Norton, learning of his wife's campaign, responded with his own counter-pamphlet, a vitriolic, self-pitying document that attacked Caroline's character, questioned her morals, and presented himself as a wronged husband, nobly defending the sacred institution of fatherhood. He painted her as a dangerous radical, a woman so consumed by bitterness that she would overturn the natural order to satisfy a personal grievance. He did not mention the beatings. He did not mention the inkstand flung at her face or the kicks that left her unable to stand. He presented himself as a victim, and his pamphlet found an audience. Among men who were not eager to see their own authority over their wives diminished. In the House of Lords, the bill was met with opposition that would have been comical had the stakes not been so high. Peers who kept mistresses rose to defend the sanctity of fatherhood. Men who had fathered children they refused to acknowledge warned gravely that giving mothers any claim would fracture the English family. A bishop declared the bill contrary to Scripture. A lord who had once been Caroline's ally turned against her, arguing that maternal affection, however touching, could not be permitted to undermine the authority of a father. The chamber agreed. The bill was voted down by men who understood, without any of them saying it aloud, that the rights being proposed for women would come at the expense of powers they themselves enjoyed. Caroline did not stop. She never stopped. She wrote a second pamphlet, even more powerful than the first, The Separation of Mother and Child by the Law of Custody of Infants Considered. She wrote a third, a plain letter to the Lord Chancellor, published under the pseudonym Pierce Stevenson, a transparent disguise that fooled nobody, but preserved the fiction that a woman would not address the Lord Chancellor directly on matters of law. She lobbied every sympathetic ear in Parliament. She wrote scores of letters to every member who might be persuaded, to every editor who might publish her arguments, to every person of influence who might lend their voice. She was relentless, tireless, and fueled by a rage that never cooled, because the cause of it, 3 children growing up without her, was renewed every single morning when she woke. Thomas Talfourd reintroduced the bill. The arguments were refined, the language adjusted, the scope narrowed to make it nearly impossible for opponents to call it radical. The bill asked only for the most modest concession, that a mother of unblemished character might be permitted to petition for access to her children under the age of 7. It did not challenge paternal authority. It did not propose equality. It merely proposed that a mother was not nothing. In August 1839, the Custody of Infants Act received royal assent. It was the first piece of legislation in English history to acknowledge that a mother had any legal right to her children. It allowed women who had not been convicted of adultery to petition for custody of children under 7 and for access to older children at fixed intervals. It was imperfect. It was limited. It was a crack in a wall that had stood for centuries. It was revolutionary, and it did not save Caroline's sons. The passage of the Custody of Infants Act should have been Caroline Norton's moment of triumph. She had done what no woman in English history had ever done. She had changed the law. She had taken on Parliament, the judiciary, the entire weight of centuries of legal tradition, and she had won. The Act was modest in its scope. Custody of children under 7, access to older children. But it was a rupture in a dam that had held for hundreds of years, and it had been created by a woman who could not vote, could not stand for office, could not appear in court, could not even sign a contract in her own name. She should have felt victory. Instead, she felt the cold, precise cruelty of a man who understood that the law was a game, and that he was not finished playing it. George Norton, upon learning that the Custody of Infants Act had received royal assent, did not panic. He did not rage. He did something far worse. He studied the text of the Act, identified its jurisdictional limits, and acted with the methodical efficiency of a man pulling the wings from a fly. He moved the children to Scotland. The Act applied only in England, Wales, and Ireland. It had no power north of the border. By placing the boys with relatives in Scotland, by Saint, beyond the reach of the very law their mother had written into existence, George ensured that Caroline's victory was hollow. She had changed the law of England, and he had simply stepped outside it. The cruelty of this maneuver lay not only in its effectiveness, but in its timing. He waited until the Act was passed. He waited until Caroline believed, for perhaps the first time in 3 years, that she might hold her children again. He waited until hope had crept back into her life like warmth, returning to a frozen limb. And then he extinguished it. She wrote to the boys. She wrote constantly, weekly, sometimes daily. Letters that she addressed with care and sealed with the attention of a woman who knew that each envelope was a message in a bottle, cast into an ocean of silence with no certainty that it would ever reach shore. She wrote about ordinary things: the weather in London, the flowers in the park, the cat she had seen sleeping on a wall in Mayfair. She wrote about the books she was reading, suggesting titles she thought they might enjoy. She told them she loved them. She told them she missed them. She told them she had not forgotten. George intercepted every letter. Not one reached the boys. He read them, presumably, one can only imagine with what mixture of satisfaction and contempt. And then he disposed of them. 3 years of a mother's love, written on paper, folded into envelopes, sealed with wax, carried by the Royal Mail across the length of England to a house in Scotland, where they were destroyed by the hands of the man who had taken her children in the first place. She sent birthday presents. She sent Christmas gifts. Small things, carefully chosen, wrapped with the exquisite care of a woman who was not certain whether her sons still remembered what she looked like. George returned them, or discarded them. The boys received nothing from their mother and were told that she had sent nothing, that she had forgotten them, that she did not care. 3 years of this. 3 years of writing into void. 3 years of waking each morning to the knowledge that her children were alive somewhere beyond her reach, growing, changing, becoming people she would not recognize, learning to live without her, and being taught, actively and deliberately, that she had chosen to live without them. Years later, when the boys were old enough to understand, Fletcher would tell his mother the truth about those years in Scotland. He told her that they had been informed by their father, by the relatives who kept them, by the careful, repetitive drip of a lie told so often it calcifies into fact, that their mother had abandoned them. They were told she did not want them. They were told she was wicked, that she had done shameful things, that their father had removed them for their own protection, that he was shielding them from a woman too corrupt to raise children. 3 small boys, growing up in a cold house in Scotland, far from everything they knew, wondering in the silence of a nursery that was not their nursery, in beds that were not their beds, why their mother did not come, why she did not write, why she had left without saying goodbye. Because they did not know she had been at her sister's house that March morning, did not know she had returned to find them gone, did not know she had torn London apart trying to find them. They knew only what they had been told, and what they had been told was a lie so precisely designed to inflict maximum damage that it would take years, decades, to undo. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you do not. Because what George Norton did next makes everything I have just described look like a prelude. A mother who writes every week, whose letters are destroyed before they reach her children, who sends gifts that are returned or thrown away, who fights to change the very law of the land so that she can hold her sons again. That mother is, in every way that matters, present. But her children cannot know that. They know only the silence. They know only the absence. And a child who believes his mother chose to leave him carries that wound forever. Even after the truth emerges, even after he understands, even after he forgives, the scar remains. Caroline endured those years the way a woman of her class and era was expected to endure, outwardly composed, inwardly shattered. She attended dinners, she made conversation, she smiled when smiling was required, and she went home each evening to rooms that still contained the small shoes her sons had outgrown, to a doorframe where she had once measured their heights in pencil. Fletcher to here, Brinsley to here, William, the smallest, barely reaching her hip. She could not bear to look at those marks, and she could not bring herself to paint over them. And so they remained, the last physical evidence that her children had once lived in this house, that they had once stood still long enough for their mother to press a pencil against the wood and draw a line and say, with the ordinary confidence of a woman who did not yet know what was coming, "Look how tall you are getting." And then, in 1842, the thing she had feared above all others came to pass. William, the youngest, the baby who had been 3 years old when George tore him from her arms, fell from a horse at the estate where he was being kept. The injury seemed minor at first, a scrape, a bruise, nothing, they said, to cause alarm, but within days an infection had taken hold. In an era before antibiotics, before anyone understood the mechanism by which wounds turned septic, a simple cut could become a death sentence with terrifying speed. William's condition deteriorated. He developed a fever. The fever worsened. The doctor was summoned. A local man, well-meaning, but working with the limited tools of an age that did not understand infection. He prescribed rest. He prescribed cool compresses. He may have prescribed laudanum for the pain. He did not know what was killing the boy because no one in 1842 knew what was killing anyone. They called it blood poisoning. They called it wound fever. They called it the will of God. It was septicemia, and it was eating William Norton alive. And George Norton, the father who had claimed absolute custody, who had insisted that the children were his and his alone to control, who had moved them to Scotland specifically to prevent their mother from reaching them, did not send for Caroline. He did not tell her that her son was ill. He did not inform her that the child she had not been allowed to hold for 6 years was slipping away. Days passed. The fever climbed. William grew weaker. And still no word was sent to London. Whether George deliberately withheld the information or simply did not consider it necessary to inform a woman he had spent years training himself to regard as irrelevant, no one can say with certainty. The result was the same. A 9-year-old boy lay dying in a house in Scotland, and the woman who had carried him, who had nursed him, who had fought to change the law of an entire nation so that she could hold him again, did not know. By the time word finally reached her, carried not by George but by a sympathetic relative who could no longer bear the weight of the secret, Caroline made the agonizing journey north. She travelled by carriage and by the newly built railways, changing trains at junctions, pressing money into the hands of porters and drivers, begging them to hurry, knowing with a certainty that lived in her body like a physical pain that she was running out of time. The journey from London to Scotland in 1842 could take the better part of 2 days. 2 days of rattling through countryside she could not see because her eyes were blinded with tears. 2 days of praying to a God she was not certain she still believed in. 2 days of holding on to the desperate, irrational hope that she would arrive in time, that she would walk through the door and find him thin and pale, but alive, and that she would sit beside his bed and hold his hand and tell him that she was there, that she had always been there, that she had never stopped trying to reach him. She arrived at the house where her youngest son lay. She found him. William Norton was dead. He was 9 years old. He had spent more than half his life separated from his mother by the deliberate act of his father and the indifferent machinery of the law. Caroline held the body of the child she had been denied. She washed him. She dressed him. She performed the small, unbearable rituals of a mother's grief, smoothing his hair, straightening his collar, pressing her lips to the forehead. That was already cool beneath her mouth. She had not been permitted to comfort him during his illness. She had not been permitted to sit beside his bed and hold his hand while the fever burned through him. She had not been there to whisper the things a mother whispers to a frightened child, that she was there, that it would be all right, that she would not leave him, because she had not been allowed to be there, because the law had said she had no right. She would later write about William's death in terms that stripped away every layer of composure she had built over years of public performance. The pain was raw, naked, and unanswerable. She blamed George for the negligence that had allowed a minor injury to become fatal, for the delay in summoning medical attention, for the years of separation that had stolen whatever time they might have had together. She blamed the law that had given a violent, indifferent man absolute power over children he treated as pawns in a game of spite. And she blamed herself, irrationally, helplessly, in the way that grieving parents always blame themselves, for not fighting harder, for not finding a way, for not tearing down the walls between them with her bare hands. The other boys, Fletcher, now 13, and Brinsley, 11, watched their mother grieve and understood, perhaps for the first time, the full cost of what their father had done. They were old enough now to question the stories they had been told, old enough to wonder why, if their mother truly did not want them, she had come so far and so fast when the news arrived, old enough to see, in the depth of her anguish, the evidence of a love they had been taught to doubt. William was buried, and Caroline Norton returned to London with something new hardening inside her. Not grief alone, though the grief was oceanic, but a resolve that had been forged in the furnace of the most devastating loss a parent can endure. The death of her youngest son had burned away whatever faith she still held that the system might be persuaded by reason alone. Reason had won her the Custody of Infants Act, and George had simply moved the children to Scotland. The law could be changed, and men like George would find ways around it. What was needed was not a single reform, but a wholesale demolition of the legal framework that treated women as less than human. She would spend the next 30 years working toward exactly that. And the engine that drove her was not hope. Hope had died in a cold room in Scotland with a 9-year-old boy. The engine was fury. Pure, undiluted, righteous fury that would not rest until the law reflected what she had always known. That a mother is a person, that her love has weight and standing, and that no man's cruelty should ever again have the power to separate a woman from her children. After William's death, George permitted Caroline to see the surviving boys. Whether this was an act of belated conscience or a calculation that continued denial would generate the kind of public sympathy that could further damage his own position, no one can say with certainty. The effect was the same. Fletcher and Brinsley were allowed occasional visits with their mother, though always under conditions that ensured she understood who held the power. But the boys who returned to her were not the boys she had lost. Fletcher was 13 now, a serious, watchful young man who had spent 6 years being told that his mother was wicked and had abandoned them. Brinsley was 11, quieter than his mother remembered, with a wariness in his eyes that had not been there before. They did not run to her when they entered the room. They stood at a distance and regarded her with the careful assessment of children who have learned to distrust the adults in their lives. The damage George had done was not merely legal, it was psychological, etched into the fabric of their characters, and it would take years of patient, painful rebuilding before the wounds began to close. Caroline had to teach her own sons to trust her again. She had to undo the lies their father had told them, lies that she was unfit, that she was immoral, that she had chosen to leave them. She had to do this in stolen visits, a few hours at a time, while George retained the power to withdraw access at any moment if she displeased him. Every conversation carried the weight of its fragility. Every embrace had the desperate quality of something that might be the last. Fletcher, the eldest, would never fully recover from the years of separation. He grew into a restless young man, handsome like his mother, quick-tempered like his father, carrying within him the unresolvable confusion of a child who had been used as a weapon in a war between his parents. He had spent his formative years being told that his mother was wicked and had abandoned him, and even after the truth emerged, even after he understood that she had fought to reach him, that she had changed the law itself in her effort to hold him, the scar tissue remained. The lies George had planted in a 7-year-old boy had taken root in the bedrock of his character, and no amount of truth, however gently applied, could fully extract them. He loved his mother. That was never in doubt. But he loved her the way a person loves when trust has been shattered and imperfectly rebuilt, with a wariness that never fully disappeared, a flinch behind the embrace, a part of himself always braced for the next abandonment that his rational mind knew would not come, but his wounded child's heart could never quite stop expecting. He drank. He was reckless with money and reckless with carriages and reckless in the particular way of young men who carry a pain they cannot articulate, and so express it through velocity instead. His mother watched this, watched the damage George had inflicted on their son, playing out year after year in Fletcher's restless, self-destructive energy, and understood that some of what the law had taken from her could never be given back. The years between 7 and 13 were gone. The years when a mother shapes a boy's understanding of safety, of constancy, of the reliability of love. Those years had been spent in a cold house in Scotland, with a lie where his mother should have been. In 1859, Fletcher was travelling by carriage. The accounts differ on exactly where, exactly when, exactly how, when the vehicle overturned. He was thrown. The injuries were catastrophic. He was 30 years old. The news reached Caroline in London. She had survived. The death of William 17 years earlier had somehow absorbed that blow and continued to stand, continued to write, continued to fight. But a human heart is not a muscle that grows stronger with each breaking. It is more like glass. Each fracture weakens the structure, makes the next break more likely, makes the eventual shattering more complete. She had lost William at 9, before she had the chance to rebuild their bond. She lost Fletcher at 30, after years of fragile, imperfect, precious reconnection, years in which she had watched him struggle with the damage his father had done and had been unable to fix it. She had changed the law so that mothers could keep their children, and the law had come too late for William and had not been enough for Fletcher. She had won the legal argument and lost the human one. The system had been reformed, and her boys were still dead, 2 sons buried, 1 son remaining, and the man who had set all of it in motion, who had taken the children, moved them to Scotland, told them their mother was wicked, intercepted the letters, returned the gifts, refused to send for her when William was dying. That man was still alive, still legally her husband, still entitled to every penny she earned. Caroline buried Fletcher, and she continued to write. What else could she do? The pen had been her weapon for 30 years. It was all she had left. Brinsley survived. He became a man who understood with the clear-eyed sadness of someone who had lived through it, exactly what his father had done and exactly what it had cost his mother. Unlike Fletcher, Brinsley had been young enough when the separation began, 5 years old, that the lies had not taken root as deeply. Or perhaps he was simply built differently, with a temperament better suited to absorbing pain without letting it poison him from within. In his adult years, he maintained a genuine, affectionate relationship with Caroline, a relationship that bore scars, but also bore the evidence of something that had proved stronger than the damage. He had come to know the truth, and the truth, painful as it was, had freed him from the lies. The years that followed were defined by a pattern that had become the rhythm of Caroline's existence. She wrote, she campaigned, she fought, and every victory came wrapped in some new cruelty. She wrote about children. That was the thing that broke people who read her work. She could not hold her own sons, so she wrote about other people's. She published a poem about child labour in English cotton mills, children as young as 5 working 14-hour days, their small fingers caught in machinery, their bodies bent into shapes that would never straighten. She wrote about the boys who crawled beneath looms to sweep up cotton waste and were crushed when the machinery started again. She wrote about the girls who stood at spinning frames until their legs gave out and were beaten for falling. She never mentioned Fletcher or Brinsley or William by name in these pages. She did not need to. Every child in every mill was her child. Every mother in every tenement who had lost a son to the factories was Caroline Norton, and the reader who could not see that was not paying attention. She wrote novels that drew on the emotional landscape of her own experience, the isolation of a woman trapped in a destructive marriage, the particular agony of being punished for intelligence, the slow corrosion of hope in a system designed to crush it, while maintaining the fiction that they were entirely imaginary. She wrote essays, reviews, and articles for the leading periodicals of the day. She wrote constantly, compulsively, the way a person breathes when they have been held underwater too long, not for pleasure, but for survival. Each publication was an act of defiance. Each royalty check was a reminder of the law's cruelty, because every penny she earned still belonged to George. Every word she wrote was, in the eyes of the law, his property as much as hers. In 1848, George decided to make this humiliation explicit. He wrote directly to Caroline's publishers, to the editors who commissioned her work, to the firms that printed her books, and instructed them to redirect all payments to his own bank account. He did not claim to need the money for any particular purpose. He did not pretend that the instruction was anything other than what it was, an exercise of legal power for the pure satisfaction of exercising it. He was rubbing her face in the law's partiality, reminding her that no matter how brilliantly she wrote, no matter how celebrated she became, no matter how many copies her books sold, the money was his, because she was his, because the law said so. Caroline was now caught in a trap so grotesque that it defied rational description. She was supporting herself entirely through her own labor. George contributed nothing to her maintenance and had not done so for years. They lived separately. They had no functioning marriage in any meaningful sense, and yet every novel, every poem, every essay she produced was generating revenue for the man who had beaten her, taken her children, and attempted to have her publicly branded an adulteress. She fought back with the only weapon she possessed, the savage, unanswerable logic of a woman who had spent 2 decades studying the law that oppressed her. When her creditors came calling, tradesmen she had engaged, bills she had accumulated in the ordinary course of maintaining a household, she discovered yet another dimension of the absurdity. She could not be sued in her own name, because the law considered her a legal phantom, absorbed into her husband, invisible to the courts. But neither could she defend herself, because the same fiction that erased her identity also denied her the right to appear before a judge. Her response was characteristic of the woman: sharp, witty, logically devastating, and designed to cause George Norton the maximum possible embarrassment. She instructed her creditors to sue George instead. Her reasoning was elegant and unanswerable. If the law declares that I do not exist as a legal person, if everything I own, everything I earn, every contract I enter into is legally my husband's, then surely my debts must also be his. If I cannot own property, I cannot owe money. If I cannot sign a contract, I cannot be bound by one. You may chase me for payment if you wish, but the law says I am not here. The law says I am him. So send the bill to George. The case went to court. George was compelled to appear, and the resulting spectacle, a man dragged before a judge to answer for debts accumulated by his estranged wife, debts she had been forced to incur because he had seized her income, laid bare the madness of the system with more clarity than 100 pamphlets could have achieved. The newspapers reported every detail. The public, which had largely forgotten the Norton scandal in the years since the Melbourne trial, was reminded of it with brutal force. Caroline lost the case on a technicality. The court ruled that she and George were still legally one person, and that person was George, and George was not liable for debts he had not personally authorized. But the publicity was devastating to him and invaluable to her cause. She had held the law up to the light and forced the public to see exactly what it looked like. And what it looked like was not merely unjust, it was insane. In 1854, she published what many consider her masterwork of legal advocacy, English Laws for Women in the 19th Century. It was not a pamphlet this time. It was a book, comprehensive, meticulously researched, furiously argued, running to nearly 100 pages of analysis that would not have been out of place in a legal journal. She cited statutes. She quoted precedents. She assembled case after case, each more devastating than the last, documenting the way the law functioned as an instrument of systematic oppression against married women. She wrote, "A married English woman has no legal existence. Her being is absorbed in that of her husband." She wrote, "She may not leave her husband's house. Not by any force of her own may she obtain a divorce. She may be beaten within an inch of her life, and the law will not protect her." She wrote, "An English wife cannot make a will. She cannot legally earn. She has no property, not even the clothes upon her back. Her husband may take her earnings, sell her possessions, and leave her destitute, and the law will assist him in doing it." These were not opinions. These were facts. Legal facts, documented in the statute books, enforced by the courts, and endured by every married woman in England who had the misfortune to be bound to a man who chose to exercise the full extent of his legal power. Caroline assembled them with the precision of a prosecuting barrister building an airtight case, and published them for the entire reading public to see. She named no names. She did not need to. Everyone who read the book understood that the anonymous wife whose suffering threaded through every chapter was Caroline herself. The impact was considerable. Copies circulated in Parliament. Excerpts were reprinted in newspapers. Reviewers, even those uncomfortable with the spectacle of a woman arguing about the law, acknowledged the devastating force of her analysis. It was impossible to read English laws for women and maintain the comfortable fiction that the system was fair, that it protected women adequately, that the occasional hard case was an aberration rather than the inevitable product of a structure designed to treat half the population as property. The following year, in June 1855, she did something that made even her allies draw a sharp breath. She wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. Consider the audacity of this. A woman who could not open a bank account, a woman who could not sign a lease, a woman whose legal existence had been absorbed into that of the husband who had beaten her. This woman sat down at a desk, dipped a pen in ink, and wrote directly to the sovereign of the British Empire to inform her that the laws of her realm were barbaric. It was not a plea for personal mercy. Caroline Norton had never begged for anything in her life, and she was not about to begin now, not even before her queen. The letter laid before Victoria the full reality of what the law did to married women, her subjects, her citizens, women who had no voice in the Parliament that governed them, and no recourse in the courts that judged them. She described in language that was careful but unflinching the mechanisms by which a husband could legally destroy his wife, seize her property, claim her earnings, take her children, beat her with impunity, and leave her with no remedy. And she made Victoria understand that these were not rare abuses by rare monsters. They were the ordinary operation of ordinary law applied to ordinary women in every parish and every county and every city in England. She addressed Victoria not as a subject addressing a monarch, but as one woman addressing another. The letter was deferential in form and revolutionary in substance. And it reached the one person in England whose sympathy could translate into political pressure of a kind that no pamphlet, however brilliant, could generate alone. Parliament was already debating divorce reform. The Lord Chancellor, Lord Cranworth, had introduced a bill to establish civil courts for divorce, eliminating the ruinous expense of a private Act of Parliament that had made divorce effectively impossible for anyone who was not wealthy, well-connected, and male. The political ground had been shifting for years, and Caroline Norton's decades of agitation had helped prepare it. Her pamphlets were cited in parliamentary debates. Her arguments were repeated by reformers who had never met her but who recognized the unanswerable force of her logic. Her suffering, which she had made so devastatingly public, had become the most visible symbol of a system that even its defenders could no longer pretend was just. In 1857, the Matrimonial Causes Act became law. It established the Court for Divorce and Matrimonial Causes, the first civil court in England empowered to dissolve marriages. It allowed a wife, for the first time, to petition for divorce on grounds of adultery combined with cruelty, desertion, bigamy, or incest. It was not equality. A husband could still divorce his wife for adultery alone, while she was required to prove additional aggravating factors. But it was a door that had been welded shut for centuries, and Caroline Norton had forced it open. 2 acts of Parliament, 2 fundamental changes to the legal landscape of England, and the third was already on its way. The Married Women's Property Act of 1870, which allowed married women to retain their own earnings, inherit property in their own names, and take legal action independently, would not come until the final years of Caroline's life. She was not the only voice calling for it, and by 1870 the women's rights movement had grown far beyond what any single campaigner could claim credit for. But every historian who has studied the period acknowledges the same truth. Without Caroline Norton's pamphlets, without her public testimony, without her refusal to be silenced, the legal framework that enabled the 1870 Act would not have been in place. She had laid the foundation. Others would build upon it. 3 acts of Parliament, 3 cracks in a wall that had imprisoned women for centuries. And at the centre of all 3, a woman the law said did not exist. And what of George? Because your audience deserves to know what happened to the man who started all of this. The man who threw inkstands at a pregnant woman, who stole 3 children from their mother's house on a March afternoon, who moved them to Scotland to outrun the law his wife had written, who did not send word when his youngest son lay dying. George Norton's life after the trial was a study in slow, irreversible decay, not dramatic ruin, not the sudden public humiliation that he had tried to inflict on Caroline. Something worse, something quieter, the kind of destruction that happens when a man's name becomes synonymous with cruelty and the world simply stops pretending otherwise. Caroline's pamphlets had made him the most notorious husband in England. Every time the Custody of Infants Act was cited in a courtroom, and it was cited frequently, as more and more women discovered they had a legal claim to their children, George Norton's name hovered behind the statute like a stain. Legal scholars discussed his case. Newspaper editorials referenced it. The reforms Caroline had forced through Parliament were, in every practical sense, a monument to his brutality. Laws that existed because one man's cruelty had been so extreme, so systematic, and so thoroughly documented by his brilliant wife, that the legislature could no longer pretend the system was just. He knew this. He lived with it. Every drawing room he entered, every dinner table he sat at, every social gathering where his name was announced, he carried the knowledge that the people around him knew. They knew he had beaten her. They knew he had taken the children. They knew about the trial, and the paid witnesses, and the letters intercepted, and the boy who died in Scotland while his mother was not told. Caroline had put all of it into print, and print does not forget. His magistracy, the position Caroline's friendship with Melbourne had secured for him, was eventually lost. His political career, which had never amounted to much, amounted to nothing. His brother, Lord Grantley, whose inheritance George had spent decades waiting for, maintained a careful distance. The Norton family name, which George had done nothing to earn and everything to disgrace, became a cautionary tale. The story that mothers told other mothers, the name that lawyers cited when arguing for reform. He grew old. He grew irrelevant. The world moved on and left him standing in the wreckage of the life he had spent half a century destroying. Not just Caroline's life, but his own. He had entered the marriage with a beautiful wife, powerful connections, and the prospect of a distinguished career. He emerged from it with nothing but a reputation for cruelty that would follow his name into the history books and beyond. He died alone, effectively. Not in the literal sense. There were people around him, servants and relatives who attended to the mechanics of dying. But he died without the love of the woman he had tormented, without the respect of the one surviving son who had come to understand exactly what his father had done, without the regard of a society that had long since taken Caroline's measure of him and found it accurate. He died, and the overwhelming public response was not grief, but relief. Relief that Caroline Norton was finally, at last, after 48 years, free of him. George Chapel. Norton died on the 20th of March, 1875. He was 75 years old, and the most fitting epitaph for his life was not carved on any headstone, but written in the statute books of England. 3 laws that existed because he had been so monstrous that Parliament was shamed into action. His cruelty was his legacy. Caroline ensured that. Now he was gone. And for the first time since she was 19 years old, Caroline Norton was legally free. She was 66. She had spent her entire adult life, every year from 19 to 66, as the legal property of a man who had beaten her, stolen her children, claimed her earnings, and attempted to destroy her reputation. She had not been able to own property. She had not been able to sign a contract. She had not been able to walk through a door without the knowledge that the law considered her less than a full human being. 48 years. Consider that number. Consider what it means to live nearly half a century in a marriage you cannot escape, to a man who uses the law as a weapon, knowing that every pound you earn belongs to him, that every word you publish enriches him, that your children grew up believing you abandoned them because he told them so. Consider what it means to fight, year after year, decade after decade, for the rights that should have been yours at birth, and to win. To actually win, to change the law of an entire nation, and still not be free. She had entered that marriage as a girl of 19, dark-haired, brilliant, blazing with a wit and an intelligence that London could not get enough of. She emerged from it as an old woman. Her beauty, which had once stopped men in their tracks, had been consumed by decades of grief and exhaustion and the slow, corrosive erosion of a life spent fighting. Her health was fragile. Her income was modest. 2 of her 3 sons were dead. The years that should have been her prime, her 30s, her 40s, her 50s, had been spent not in the enjoyment of her talent and her success, but in an endless, grinding war against a legal system that refused to acknowledge she was human. And now, at 66, she was free. The prison door had opened, not because anyone had fought for her release, but because the jailer had died. There should be a word for this kind of freedom. Freedom that comes too late, that arrives after the years of living have been consumed by the years of surviving. It is not the freedom of youth, with its vast horizons and its limitless possibility. It is the freedom of an old woman standing in an open doorway, blinking at the light, and knowing that most of the road is already behind her. Of her 3 sons, only Brinsley remained. Fletcher had died in 1859, thrown from a carriage. William had died in 1842, of an infection that need not have been fatal. She had outlived 2 of her children, and the grief of that, layered upon the grief of the years she had been denied with them, was something she carried in silence, because she had learned long ago that the world did not want to hear a woman's suffering unless it could be packaged as entertainment. On the 1st of March, 1877, Caroline married Sir William Sterling Maxwell, a writer, a historian, a collector of Spanish art, a man she had known and cared for through many years of friendship that neither of them had been able to act upon while George lived. He was kind. He was gentle. He was intelligent in the way that she valued most, curious, well-read, capable of conversation that engaged her mind rather than merely filling the silence. He was, by every account, a man who saw Caroline Norton not as property to be controlled, but as a person to be admired. An extraordinary woman whose intelligence, courage, and defiance he had watched from a respectful distance for decades. Their courtship, if it can even be called that, between two people in their 60s who had known each other for years, was nothing like the first time Caroline had stood before an altar. There were no flowers chosen to impress, no extravagant promises, no performance of devotion designed to secure an asset. There was instead something quieter and more powerful. The steady, patient recognition of two people who had waited a very long time, and who understood, with the clarity that only age and suffering can provide, exactly what they were choosing and why. Sterling Maxwell had watched Caroline's battle from the beginning. He had seen her humiliated, seen her fight, seen her lose her children and lose her son, and lose every material comfort the world had to offer. And he had not turned away. He had not calculated the cost of association with her and found it too high. He had simply waited, and when George finally died and the prison door swung open, he was there. She did not weep at this wedding. She was 68 years old, and she did not feel the nameless dread that had gripped her at 19. She felt, perhaps for the first time in half a century, the simple warmth of being safe. For 3 months, Caroline Norton lived the life she should have had from the beginning. She lived in a house where no one struck her. She sat at a table where no one mocked her. She slept beside a man who did not regard her as property. She spoke and was heard. She wrote and kept the money. She existed fully, legally, humanly existed, in a way she had not been permitted to exist since she was a girl of 19, standing in a church in a white silk dress with tears she could not explain. 3 months. After 48 years of hell, the universe granted her 3 months of peace. It was not enough. It could never have been enough. But it was something. A final, gentle act of grace in a life that had been defined by its absence. She had those 3 months. She had the knowledge that love, real love, the kind that does not seek to own or control or diminish, that love existed and that she had found it, and that for 92 days she had lived inside it. On the 15th of June, 1877, Caroline Norton died at her home in London. She was 69 years old. The cause was not dramatic. No sudden illness. No tragic accident, merely the quiet failure of a body that had carried the weight of half a century of fighting. She had been strong for so long. She had endured things that would have broken most people decades earlier. And now, in the safety of a home where she was loved, her body finally set down the burden it had been carrying since 1827 and did not pick it up again. She was buried at Keir House in Perthshire, the Sterling Maxwell family estate in Scotland. And there is a particular painful irony in the fact that she rests in the same country to which George had banished her children, the country whose border he had used as a weapon against her. But there is also something fitting about it, because Scotland, which had once been her exile's wall, was now the place where she lay beside the man who had finally loved her properly. The geography that George had used to hurt her had been reclaimed by tenderness. The obituaries were generous in their praise and cautious in their language. They noted her beauty. They praised her literary talent. They acknowledged her role in legal reform. They were, for the most part, careful not to say too much about the marriage that had been the furnace in which all that reform had been forged, because even in death, even in 1877, a woman suffering at the hands of her husband was still considered a private matter rather than a public scandal. But the laws remained. The laws she had forced into existence with nothing but words. Words written by a woman who did not legally exist, published by a woman who could not own the copyright, distributed by a woman whose earnings belonged to the man who had beaten her. Those laws changed the lives of millions of women who came after her. The Custody of Infants Act of 1839 was expanded in 1873 to raise the age threshold, allowing mothers to petition for custody of children up to the age of 16, not merely 7. The principle Caroline had established, that a mother's bond with her children had legal standing, became the foundation upon which all subsequent custody law was built. Today, in every English-speaking country in the world, the standard used in custody disputes is the best interests of the child. That standard exists because Caroline Norton demonstrated, nearly 2 centuries ago, that a father's absolute right was not the same thing as a child's best interest. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 opened the door to divorce reform that continued throughout the following century, each successive act expanding the grounds, simplifying the process, and moving closer to the principle that a woman trapped in a destructive marriage should have the right to leave it. The divorce courts that exist today, in England, in Australia, in America, in every jurisdiction that traces its legal heritage to English common law, descend in a direct line from the statute that Caroline Norton's campaigning helped bring into being, and the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, extended and strengthened in 1882, established the principle that a married woman was a legal person, capable of owning property, retaining earnings, entering contracts, and taking legal action in her own name. Consider what that means. Consider how recently it was true that a married woman in England could not open a bank account in her own name, could not sign a lease, could not keep the wages she earned, could not protect the money she had saved. Many of you listening tonight, and I know you are here because this community spans generations, may remember a time when a woman needed her husband's signature to obtain credit. When a married woman's pay check was not, in any real sense, her own. When the phrase head of household was not merely a figure of speech, but a legal designation that determined who controlled the money, the property, the children, and the future. That world did not end in 1870. The legal changes Caroline Norton set in motion took more than a century to complete. In America, married women could not open credit cards in their own names until 1974. In the United Kingdom, women could not apply for a mortgage without a male guarantor until the mid-1970s. In Australia, married women were not entitled to equal pay until 1969. These were not ancient injustices. They were the lived reality of women who are alive today. Women who are listening to this story right now. Caroline Norton's fight was not a historical curiosity. It was the beginning of a revolution that is not yet finished. A revolution that moved forward in inches, in decades, in the grinding, unglamorous work of women who wrote pamphlets and lobbied politicians and stood before legislatures and said, "This is not right. This must change," and then waited and fought again and waited again and fought again until the change finally came. The bank account in your name, the salary deposited into your account, the mortgage you signed, the business you own, the custody arrangement that keeps your children with you. All of it rests upon a legal foundation that did not exist before Caroline Norton spent decades proving, at the cost of everything she loved, that it must. She did not do this alone. She was part of a movement, a slow, grinding, century-long movement toward the recognition that women were human beings entitled to the same legal protections as men. Other women fought alongside her and after her. Barbara Bodishan, Millicent Fawcett, Emmeline Pankhurst, the suffragists and the suffragettes who would carry the work forward into the 20th century. But Caroline Norton was the crack in the wall. She was the first voice that Parliament could not ignore, and she paid for that distinction with her children, her reputation, her fortune, and very nearly her sanity. And that is the story of Caroline Norton. I want to tell you something about why this story matters to me, and why I brought it to you tonight. Caroline Norton was not a saint. She was difficult, proud, sharp-tongued, and uncompromising. She made enemies easily. She could be vain. She could be combative. She refused to soften herself to make others comfortable. She was, by the standards of her era, an impossible woman, the kind of woman who makes powerful men uneasy, not because she is wrong, but because she is right, and because she will not stop saying so. She never called herself a feminist. She once wrote that the natural position of woman is inferiority to man. She was not fighting for abstract equality. She was fighting for something more basic and more urgent than that. She was fighting for the right to see her own children. She was fighting for the right to keep the money she earned. She was fighting for the right to walk away from a man who was destroying her. She was fighting for the right to exist. And she won. Not perfectly, not completely, not in time to save William, who died without his mother beside him because the law said a father's cruelty outweighed a mother's love. But she won in the way that matters most. She ensured that what happened to her could never happen to another woman in exactly the same way again. Every mother in this country who has custody of her children after a divorce, Caroline Norton, made that possible. Every woman who earns her own salary and keeps it in her own bank account, Caroline Norton helped make that possible. Every woman who has walked away from a marriage that was destroying her, Caroline Norton opened that door. She did not have a duke to save her. She did not have a powerful man who saw her suffering and swept in to carry her away. The most powerful man she knew, the Prime Minister himself, retreated when association with her became inconvenient. What she had was a pen, a fury that never died, and the absolute conviction that the law was wrong, and that she, a woman who did not legally exist, was going to change it. And she did. I want to end tonight by saying something directly to you. Whoever you are, wherever you are listening from, whatever time it is where you are, some of you know this story. Not Caroline's story specifically, but the shape of it. Some of you married men who promised one thing and delivered another. Some of you stayed in marriages that were destroying you because the world told you it was your duty, because the law made leaving impossible, because the children needed a roof and you did not know how to provide one alone. Some of you fought battles that nobody saw. Quiet battles, daily battles, the kind fought not in courtrooms or in the pages of newspapers, but in kitchens and bedrooms and the silences between words. Some of you are the daughters and granddaughters of women who fought those battles for you. Women whose names you carry and whose sacrifices you may never fully know. Caroline Norton could not have imagined you. She could not have imagined a world in which women vote, own property, lead nations, and listen to stories about her life on devices she could not have conceived of. But she fought for you. Every word she wrote, every pamphlet she published, every letter she sent to a parliament that did not want to hear from her. She did it for you. She did it for the women who would come after her, the women she would never meet, the women who would inherit the freedoms she had bled for. She would want you to know her name. She would want you to say it. Caroline Norton. Thank you for being here tonight. If her story stayed with you, if her courage, her grief, her fury, her persistence meant something, then leave a comment and tell me. Tell me about the women in your life who fought battles nobody saw. Tell me about the mothers who did not give up. Tell me where you are in the world and what time it is and whether you are angry or sad or something you cannot quite name. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next story. Because women like Caroline Norton deserve to be remembered. They deserve an audience. And 200 years after the law said she did not exist, the very least we can do is prove it wrong. I will see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves. Good night.